Super Mario Galaxy 2 was released in 2010 for the Nintendo Wii as a follow-up to the original Mario Galaxy. This game was initially meant to be just a simple expansion of the original game. However, the team had so many ideas that Miyamoto spun this into an entirely new game. Rather than picking up where the last game left off, Super Mario Galaxy 2 acts as a full-blown retelling of the original game, taking the players through a nearly identical story to the last one. One major difference, however, is that this time around, you start the game from a 2D perspective rather than a 3D view. There could be many different reasons for this, but I think the most prominent example is due to the fact that New Super Mario Bros. Wii, a game set entirely in a 2D perspective from start to finish, released only 1 year before Galaxy 2 in 2009. Nintendo most likely wanted to get the less hardcore gaming crowd into this 3D entry due to the fact that New Super Mario Bros. Wii sold millions more copies than the original Galaxy. Therefore, starting the players in a 2D perspective is a brilliant way of easing the more casual gaming audience into the game. Anyways, after that part is taken care of, Mario emerges into a slightly more open area where there is more 3D control, perhaps to ease the player in even more. It is at this point where Bowser, who is gigantic this time around, is holding Peach in one of his hands and yet again taunting Mario. After he takes off with the princess, the player is immediately taken to a launch star, which sends them flying straight into the first level. Rather than taking time to introduce you to the controls as seen in the previous game, Mario Galaxy 2 wastes no time in throwing Mario straight into the action. Nintendo seems to have expected the players to have played the original game because this time around, the hand-holding and tutorials are much less abundant. While there are completely optional forms of tutorials such as the TV screens, the important part is that they are absolutely never forced upon the player, which makes them totally harmless additions to the game. The hub world has also undergone a major overhaul compared to previously. Rather than having a somewhat explorative area to explore, like the Comet Observatory, this time around you are only given a small planet in the shape of Mario's head to run around on, called Starship Mario. It is very clear that with this entry, the team over at Nintendo wanted to focus much more on gameplay rather than story. Unlike Rosalina, there is no complex story behind Lubba, who is the main guide for the player in this game. His main purpose is mainly just to stand there and let the player take control of the game, while very rarely interrupting the pace. Yoshi is a very welcome addition this time around, especially when compared to how he functioned in Sunshine. Rather than retreating to his egg as soon as he touches water like before, he can now swim with the addition of having 3 new power-ups strictly for himself. These include the Bullberry, which allows Yoshi to walk on platforms otherwise invisible without the Bullberry. The other one is the Blimp Fruit, which allows the player to float vertically and horizontally across stages with a limited amount of usage before running out. The final and perhaps most exhilarating power-up for Yoshi is the Dash Pepper, which grants immense speed and also allows the player to run across water while riding Yoshi. All of these are great additions to the game and innovate greatly on what was seen in the previous entry. That being said, most other power-ups from the original Galaxy return except for the Flight Star and Ice Flower. I think it was an odd choice to bring back the Spring Mushroom, especially considering the backlash it received previously. If anything, it seems as though this power-up should have been removed rather than the others. There are also new power-ups just for Mario introduced as well. The Cloud Flower, the Rock Mushroom, and the Spin Drill are all completely original power-ups for this game alone. While I think the Rock Mushroom and Spin Drill are mediocre due to their restrictive usage, the Cloud Flower is probably one of the greatest Mario power-ups ever, simply due to its freedom compared to most other power-ups in the Mario series. It allows a player to create up to 3 cloud platforms for Mario to stand on, which can be used to grab secret green stars or reach hidden areas within the galaxies. Overall, I think the additions to this game are pretty enjoyable and show that Nintendo wanted to give the player more options rather than simply bringing back just the old power-ups from the original game. The level design is much more tight and compact compared to this game's predecessor. It seems as though the team had absolutely perfected the level design formula for this series, as many people seem to agree that Galaxy 2 has slightly more enjoyable levels with less filler galaxies thrown into the mix. Now this game does have its fair share of filler content, but I'll get into that later, so don't worry. For now, I'd like to talk about the world map, which functions much differently than the original Mario Galaxy. Rather than having to enter a dome and use the pole star to select a galaxy like before, there is a giant button sitting right there in front of the face ship, beckoning out to the player the entire time. Once that button is stepped on, the player is then taken to a very linear world map, functioning much more like the 2D entries than the 3D ones. So while there are technically things to discover in this game's hub, those discoveries are few and far between. Exploration is much more limited due to the fact that there is much less room to explore, and that button is always there tempting the player to hop right back into the action. Miyamoto's philosophy for designing games has always taken the priority of gameplay over story elements, which to many is very disappointing. Personally, I will say I prefer the focus of games to be placed much more on the gameplay, especially when it is a Mario game which many little kids are going to be playing. The levels in this game also have a very limited amount of stars to collect compared to before. Where in the first game, there was on average around 3 stars to collect per level, now there is usually no more than 2 stars to obtain before the prankster comments are reintroduced. That being said, I think the inclusion of the prankster comments in this game is much better than before. Rather than just appearing on a totally random galaxy, there are now comment medals which act as a gateway to unlocking the prankster comments. There is now an extra collectible within this game that was not seen before, and it gives the player an incentive to grab them, considering the fact that they unlock a very integral part to the game and play a huge role in 100% completion. These comment medals are not very hidden either, usually requiring the player to perform more advanced platforming rather than forcing them to search in every nook and cranny of the level. They are mostly out in the open, but actually obtaining them is the tricky part. While many of the comments from the first game reappear, such as the Daredevil comments and Purple Coin comments, they are much less intrusive, mainly due to the fact that you don't have to select the prankster comment if it happens to appear on a level where you haven't collected the other stars within that galaxy yet. The challenges for these levels are much more original this time around. As I mentioned in my previous video, one way to improve the prankster comments of the first game would have been to alter and change the design and layout of the levels in order to give the player a more rewarding feeling for finishing the stage. Rather than just simply adding a time limit to an already completed level, a prime example of this practice being set in motion would be in the way the speedy comments from the original game are now handled in the sequel. Rather than making the player go through a completely unaltered edition of the same level with a horribly long time limit, this time around you are only given around 30 seconds per stage, with the twist of mini clocks being placed around the level. These add a few extra seconds to the timer. The level design is also changed, and new enemies are thrown into the mix to create a much more respectable challenge. This is a far superior way to make the player repeat a level because it keeps them on edge constantly, due to the fact that they will be endlessly searching for clocks to extend their timer until they reach the end of that stage. There is also the addition of the chimp, who functions as a sort of new type of prankster comment, only rather than getting a prompt that a comment has appeared, the chimp will send Mario an invitation to challenge him in one of the stages. For example, in the Honey Hop Galaxy, the chimp will invite Mario to compete in a mini-game where he must defeat enough enemies within a time limit to receive a gold star. It's nice to see these changes to the levels within this game because it shows that Nintendo wanted to innovate and improve on as much as they could from the first game, except the story, of course. The Wii Remote mini-game levels from the first game are handled in an interesting way for the sequel. The ball rolling is brought back, while the bubble blowing and manta ray surfing mini-games are absent, with the replacement being a bird that you must guide with motion controls until the end of the stage. I think it was a particularly odd choice to bring back the ball rolling games, because they were so hated by many in the original. I just think it's weird how Nintendo strived to innovate the gameplay within the sequel, but brought back one of the most hated mechanics of the first Galaxy. Anyways, another alteration to the first game's prankster comment is the cosmic races from before. Rather than racing one shadowy version of Mario throughout the game, there are now clones that chase after Mario while he attempts to collect purple coins, complete a level, or accomplish any other task. Overall, the sequel handles the comments in a much less arbitrary and restrictive way than before. The next thing I want to mention is the functionality of coins compared to star bits. As I discussed before, coins in the first Galaxy game were almost completely useless and there was no incentive to collect them. This time, star bits still grant the player 1-ups like before, but they are no longer used to feed the hungry Lumas within stages. Now the star bits are only restricted to feeding the world map Lumas. Now coins serve the functionality of feeding these Lumas and unlocking the extra bonus stages. This actually gives the player a reason to go out of their way to collect coins because they know they will receive the most significant collectible within the game after completing the level they unlock from these coins. That collectible, of course, being the gold stars. That was a very smart move on Nintendo's part, because if they kept the function of coins limited to how they were before, unlocking secret levels would have lost almost all of its magic because it was already done by collecting star bits in the first game. The music in the sequel isn't any less impressive than the first game's soundtrack. Galaxy 2 has a lot more blue skies for its setting compared to the original game, which was made up of mostly dark ambient stages. The soundtrack reflects this, as most of the music in Galaxy 2 aims to be much more upbeat and it gives off a very cheery feeling. Take for example the Yoshi Star Galaxy. It's a truly impressive feat that Nintendo was able to pull off such fitting and atmospheric music for both of these games, and there is almost never a slouch with any song within both of these titles. It shows how even in a Mario game, Nintendo still cares to go all out on creating memorable and beautiful memories for all players to enjoy, regardless of age. While this game does do many things right, it definitely has its fair share of padding. I think the green stars serve as a much better way of unlocking the final stage compared to how the original game did it. Previously, the player was required to collect all 120 power stars within the game to unlock Luigi. You then had to collect all of these stars again with Luigi, while zero changes were made to any of these stages. Now, rather than being forced to play the game over again with Luigi, you must collect all initial 120 stars like before. But after that, there is an additional 120 green stars added to the mix that serve as their own unique challenge. This adds up to a staggering 240 total power stars. To be honest, this was completely unnecessary. I generally like the addition of these green stars, however they are executed quite poorly. So much time is wasted due to the fact that every time a player collects a star, they are booted out of the level and forced to re-enter. There are 3 green stars per galaxy, which adds to a disgusting amount of wasted time stemming from just the act of collecting the stars and re-entering the stage. Many of these stars could have been altered or removed entirely, as many of them are just completely insulting or can be seen in plain sight. On the other side of the spectrum, some of these stars are hidden in completely ridiculous locations that would take the player hours to find without a guide. No player should ever be forced into looking at a guide for something so integral to completion. However, there are still lots of these stars that are hidden in brilliant locations. I just wish there was more thought put into the less important ones. The biggest problem with these is that in order to unlock the final galaxy of the game, you must get all of the green stars, which in and of itself is not a horrible idea, but again, the way it is executed is where the issues begin. If there had been maybe half of the amount of green stars as seen in the game now, achieving this task would have been much more doable for a wider audience. If you want a player to experience everything your game has to offer, they should be given a reason to explore every aspect of it, rather than being forced to waste hours of their lives or resort to looking at a guide, because these things get old very quickly. The last thing I want to mention before signing off is the Grand Master Galaxy, which adds as the game's ultimate challenge. I think it is absolutely ridiculous how in order to unlock this level, the player is required to collect 9,999 star bits and give it to the male toad on top of already having to collect the green stars. However, I will say collecting the star bits is not necessary if only trying to unlock the first level of the Grand Master Galaxy. These only become relevant if you want to attempt the Prankster Comet, titled The Perfect Run, where there are no checkpoints and you only have 1 hit point. That being said, the Grand Master Galaxy is a brutal challenge fitting for the ultimate conclusion of the game. It is very cinematic to finally unlock this stage after all the tasks you are forced to complete beforehand. Rather than being a stage with absolutely no challenge like the first game's grand finale, the Grand Master Galaxy of the sequel truly tests the player on all abilities taught throughout the course of the game. Completion is nothing short of exhilarating for this stage. In the end, I think both Super Mario Galaxy games have their merits. The first game focuses more on cinematic, while the sequel is centered entirely on gameplay. If I had to choose between these two games, I really couldn't decide because they are both enjoyable in completely different ways. However, I will say I've enjoyed coming back to Galaxy 2 more often because I think it offers more replayability with its larger sections of levels and content. But in my opinion, the original Galaxy leaves a better first-time impression due to its beautiful cinematics and storytelling. Both of these games are definitely worth playing, especially for those who are fans of the Super Mario series, and these are two of the finest titles this franchise has to offer. Thank you all for watching this video, as I put a lot of effort into it. That's it for now, but be sure to join me for the next video if you enjoyed this one. I'll see you guys later.